You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 333 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Trump's administration and 14 people he's nominated to be U.S. ambassadors who gave a significant amount of money to his inauguration fund. I'm going to update the status of Julian Assange's asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in the UK. And then significant fighting has broken out in Libya, so I'll update who's on whose side there and what's going on. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute. There you can find my daily news roundup and the show featured on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you're subscribing to the show somewhere. I think the way you get the most out of the show is to listen to every episode. That way, you kind of get all the stories that I'm updating around the world. A lot of these wars that I'm talking about and different, political tensions and crises going on are very complex and they have a lot of nuance. And so if you're catching every show, you're going to get the most of that. iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, BitChute, pretty much wherever you're going to listen, it should be up there. And then if you really want to support the show and donate to it, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, first up on today's show is this story about U.S. ambassadors having donated an average of $300,000 to Trump's inauguration fund and then receiving diplomatic posts, or at least being nominated to them and having very questionable credentials for that post. There's 14 of these nominations that were singled out. And, I just want to take a second here because I believe this article was published at MSNBC. It's very, good. They go through in detail. They look at these different people and then they actually, I think, go back through and look at, are they qualified for this job? And certainly you have to take a minute to think now that, maybe if, they were challenging and bringing up every single time, Trump was nominating an ambassador who had donated to him and kind of doing exposés on that, they could really mount like real pressure and have real scandals pile up on Donald Trump because they're laid out there. But they were too distracted by the damn stupid fake Russiagate thing every time. And so, now that does really seem like there's some people walking it back, and even John Brennan is walking it back, saying that, it might not be as much as he thought it was. There's room for other journalism and other reporting about, real terrible things that the Trump administration is doing. Hell, maybe once this thing finally all the way dies, we could get around to talking about Yemen a little bit. But to get back on the real subject here and to single out two ambassador posts where, this was the case, it was a high level donor. One was to the United Arab Emirates. So this is a significant post, as I said. There's this Yemen war going on. The UAE is a significant party to it and receives a lot of backing and help by the United States to wage that war alongside Saudi Arabia, and also receiving a lot of support from the UK. But if the United States, let's say, wants to pressure the Emirates to, lift some of the blockade and allow some food into the country or shut down the torture prisons they're running there, you have to really wonder, is this guy qualified and capable, and does he kind of know all the little things that you're going to have to know? And you would really think that this would be like a scholar of the Emirates, really understanding the complexities of their country. I mean, it's I think a bunch of almost little federations held together by ruling families with significant oil reserves. And of course, there's, I think, a pretty strict interpretation of Islamic law that largely rules that country. As Brian Sadie explained on the show, there's an awful lot of corruption and smuggling that goes on there. A lot of that at least allowed by the state. And so, you have all these things going on. Then Trump appoints, one of his donors to the post. Now, I guess in occasions, it may be possible that, it just so happens that this guy really likes Trump and is qualified for this post. But in this case, it really didn't seem to be the case. A more glaring example of that was Trump's ambassador to Iceland, who actually had never been to the country before. And I guess some people, may kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, like if it's the ambassador to the Bahamas, who really cares? I mean, the problem is that Iceland isn't the Bahamas, and there's kind of some Cold War lasting bases or potential bases in that country. I know in the past they looked at either did reopen or were planning to reopen one in Icelandic territory. And so this is important, and they're just kind of being sold. Now, this isn't anything new. It was something that when I discovered it in the Obama administration, boy, did I think it was going to be the biggest scandal. I was kind of a newer libertarian at the time, but I remember seeing some footage of his ambassador to Denmark's nomination. And I guess this guy had, either given money or somebody he knew had given a bunch of money to the Obama administration. And they're up there asking him, well, have you ever been to the country? And he's like, no. And I was like baffled and astounded. How could this possibly happen? And shouldn't this be a huge scandal the next day that, apparently these ambassadorships are nearly being sold? I mean, I guess not quite technically. It's not like there was a contract or a handshake or maybe even a secret agreement, but there is definitely a feeling in what I think is probably a culture in Washington, D.C. that says if you want to be an ambassador, you donate a lot of money to one of these, presidential, either inauguration funds or maybe a PAC or something like that. And, that's the way you get moved on to, the short list to be ambassador. And the other thing I'll say is unfortunate, and maybe I could tie in a little bit of the NATO 70th anniversary stuff here, is that I think this is the kind of trends that people were really hoping Trump would change. Now, remember, some of the things that people really latched onto about Donald Trump was, hey, I'm a billionaire. So, nobody could buy me. I buy politicians. I bought Jeb Bush. I could buy Hillary Clinton. You better bet I could buy Marco Rubio, but who's going to give me any money? I got all the money I could ever need and a lot more. And yet, even if it's not the fact that Trump is just looking for donations to his inauguration fund, it's just kind of the culture of Washington, D.C. and a lot of problems with it. But, this is another thing. NATO, people think, wow, Trump may really be the one that could butt the trend in NATO, and realizing that this alliance is useless. And, this was a big deal to libertarians. And, certainly when Trump was coming into office, I was saying, hey, if this is one of the things the president wants to do, he has my absolute full support on it. It didn't pan out, and maybe I was too optimistic. Maybe I was, just trying to encourage him along. But certainly as retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor calls it, the zombie of NATO continues to just feed and grow slowly. Trump has really done nothing to stop that. When we look at the additions of Montenegro and soon to be Macedonia, also the continued push to include both the Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, James Carden explains, hey, look, this is a red line for the Russians. They say that, we're willing to do crazy things to prevent these countries from joining NATO because, to us, this is kind of like Canada and Mexico are to you. Think about losing the Cold War and, trying to include Mexico into the Warsaw Pact. You would go ballistic, wouldn't you? Well, that's what we're going to do if you try to include Ukraine into NATO. And there certainly seems to be the push in that direction. I think those elections there are going to have a big impact on how that turns out. There's a really good episode of Around the Empire I'll link to in the show notes page where I forget who Joanne Leone's guest is, but he does a great job of kind of breaking down the political landscape of that country. And so we may have a little bit more of a clear window on what could happen there in the upcoming election runoff. Gilbert Doctorow is, of course, the kind of, I feel like, great scholar on the U.S.-Russia kind of Cold War type relationship. I have so much respect for the guy, and he has a great article at antiwar.com that I'll also link to in the show notes page. Just, really, this is creating a huge problem and so much unnecessary conflict between the U.S. and Russia to have this growing, NATO behemoth that at this point doesn't need to exist. And then the last article I'll mention, have linked to in the show notes page, is by Doug Bandow. And this particularly focuses in on the Fort Trump situation, wanting to station permanent forces in Poland. And of course, Poland shares that small border with a Russian enclave and, the potential for problems there. There was also, I forget which article pointed out, that there was actually a time in some of I believe the Kosovo War, where there was a potential conflict between NATO forces and Russian. And it was actually UK general that said no to Supreme Commander Wesley Clark. Bandow's article also does a very good job of breaking down how if the United States continues to put all of our army and spend all of our money to combat NATO, then the rest of Europe is going to feel pretty uninclined to do so themselves because, what is Lithuania spending a few extra million or $1 billion a year on their military really going to do when the U.S. military budget is, in total, well over $1 trillion. So not any kind of new news in all of that, but there were just so many good articles written as these guys took advantage of NATO's 70th anniversary. And so I want to give a couple minutes on my show to that. And I'll also link to all these articles in the show notes page. That way, if you're more interested in being able to explain to NATO people why we should leave NATO and Trump was right, drain the swamp kind of stuff, that'll all be there. Bandow, Doctorow, Carden, and Macgregor. A couple civil liberties groups are suing the different U.S. intelligence agencies because they have this pre-publication policy, which basically says that if you're any kind of former intelligence agent, CIA, I guess military intelligence, etc., you have to submit whatever you write to the intelligence agency prior to publication. So obviously there's a real problem with censorship there. If nothing else, just by adding another step to the publication process, it delays whatever, important information from coming out, and it can really allow it to be censored or changed. And hell, even if, they say, oh, well, we only make 2 changes a year. The fact is that people know the CIA or whatever other intelligence agency has the power to censor or change something if they don't like the way it's written. And so then they're going to tailor what they say and change their message because of that alone. All right, on to the WikiLeaks stuff. So over the past couple of weeks, general developments here is some documents and photographs of the Ecuadorian president got released by an Ecuadorian lawmaker that were pretty conclusive signs of corruption. The Ecuadorian president responds to these allegations by claiming that WikiLeaks did it and that Julian Assange was violating the terms of his asylum in Ecuador by releasing his personal private information. Thursday night or Friday morning, we get a tweet from WikiLeaks saying a high-level Ecuadorian source, anonymous, gave them information that the Ecuadorian government would be handing Julian Assange over to UK authorities within hours or days. And then by Friday, I would say Friday noon, there was at least a second source also confirming, high-level source confirming what the first source had said. Now, of course, WikiLeaks puts out this tweet and they have a fan base. I really support WikiLeaks and so do a lot of other people. And so there's a rally and rush to Julian Assange's aid. And there's also a press statement put out by a UN official who apparently is somewhat high ranking, that he has a meeting with Julian Assange scheduled and agreed to by the Ecuadorian government on April 25th. By Friday evening, I guess, it was Jose Riviera on the Unity4J visual, which this past week went all weekend, giving the news that the Ecuadorian government is now saying that they were just rumors that Julian Assange was going to be handed over to the UK government. So I think as far as it, said, that's what we know for sure. Now, the guy that was on the Unity4J visual, Jose Riviera, I believe is at least the name he went by there. He did say that, he is in opposition to the Ecuadorian government, so he didn't show his face there, and maybe he's using a pseudonym or something like that. But his analysis of the situation was this, that he was actually the one that informed WikiLeaks that this information was made public by the Ecuadorian lawmakers. The president made a big deal claiming that WikiLeaks has released the information. That's why, was going to, I think, give him the clearance to kick Assange out of the embassy. But looking at a clear timeline, this was put out by the lawmaker, and then Jose Riviera tweeted at the Unity4J group this, information about the leaks being made public. And then WikiLeaks started to, tweet about that, the corruption case against the president there. Now, who released the documents, I guess, officially remains in question. The claim from Riviera was that it was a former, or I guess advisor or associate of the president who was essentially stiffed out of a deal and got upset and gave this information to an Ecuadorian lawmaker. Rivera also said that this scandal, I guess, is enough politically to bring down the Ecuadorian president. And, that seems like it would be a significant development for Julian Assange, as well as everything else. Now, another interesting thing I read about this case was that these documents were given to different people by Rivera in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. And those countries' media was reporting on it. And so while the kind of Ecuadorian state media, or, however, quote unquote, privatized it is, was giving the government and towing the government line, there was, Spanish journalism available covering these documents. And so that's kind of a cool development of the internet, seeing it really in action, doing the thing that you would always hope it would do. All right, that's where we stand today. So hopefully, Assange remains in the embassy. If this story, really was something that was going to happen, and it was only the, response and, the making public of the event, which is, is Rivera's narrative, that by the leads coming out and WikiLeaks saying this, it kind of, turned it in a big to do. And then the Ecuadorian government decided to back off. And who knows, maybe the UK then said, well, we don't want to do it if it could potentially be messy. And then the last thing here is, why else would the Ecuadorian government want to do it other than to cover up a scandal and blame all of his problems on WikiLeaks? And that is, it seems the U.S. is kind of dangling some carrots out there for Ecuador as far as gaining access to either debt relief or some U.S. aid if they agree to hand over Assange. The U.S. banned an ICC, International Criminal Court, prosecutor from entering the U.S. He is investigating potential U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. Of course, there are U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. Best example, I believe October of 2015, the bombing of a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. 20-something killed, including people fleeing the hospital after it was bombed by the U.S. airship. Terrible situation that happened there. Nobody really ever faced responsibility. The U.S. narrative changed a bunch of times. But at the end of the day, no responsibility for anybody with power. I think this, kind of example is important. Not that the U.S. ever has entered into the ICC treaty where the, ICC would have any teeth, even if it did rule that somebody in the U.S. committed war crimes. But the Trump administration did say that they were going to ban any ICC prosecutors looking into U.S. or Israeli war crimes. And so it does seem like they're willing to make good on this threat. The U.S. announced a defense cooperation pact with Lithuania. I think the big deal here is it opens them up for weapons sales and a bunch of different trainings going on between the two countries over the next 5 years. Of course, this is only going to be problematic for the U.S. relationship with Russia. We have reports out that the Energy Department failed to comply with regulations that it make regulators aware of potential nuclear technology sale and, the transfer of nuclear information to Saudi Arabia, which has been going on. Again, this is something that I think should be a bigger scandal, and maybe if, with some of the extra reporting resources have post-Russiagate, somebody could pay attention to this and hopefully, at least have a public debate on, do we really want to give Saudi Arabia a whole bunch of nuclear technology? Another thing that should get some public debate but won't is the U.S. planning to sell 24 Seahawk helicopters, and these are, I guess, an anti-submarine variant of helicopter to India. Of course, this will have implications with the U.S. and Chinese relationship, I guess, first and foremost, that, never comes up for debate. Nobody ever talks about, hey, these weapon sales could have all these other implications on U.S. policy. Nope, we're just going to sell them, and Congress isn't even going to discuss it. In Yemen, there's been some increased fighting around Hodeidah. One thing I want to mention is there's a significant amount of food, 51,000 tons, that is at risk of expiring and, starting to, I guess, rot and go bad. And it's, the warring sides in that country on the ground can't figure out a solution. It's all, Saudi Arabia and the U.S. fault too, because they're waging an air campaign in that country. And that's part of the reason why nobody on the ground will stop fighting. Big part of the reason. All right, some stories in Africa. Algeria's president resigned last week. This had been a long time coming. He said he wasn't going to seek re-election. Apparently the guy had a stroke a few years back and has been pretty limited in poor health since. So I'm sure they only continue to deteriorate in this point. He has no ability really to try to make any effort to retain his throne on power. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I guess there's like a small council put together that's currently ruling the country. But my guess is that there's a huge risk for instability and potential war to break out in Algeria as we look to somehow transfer power in that country, especially when there isn't like a firm date for elections now that the president postponed them. Right? And then in Somalia, AFRICOM admits to killing 2 civilians in an airstrike on April 1st, 2018, after initially reporting that only 5 al-Shabaab fighters were killed in that strike. The important thing here really isn't necessarily that AFRICOM admitted to killing 2 civilians. I mean, all of us who have been paying attention all along are saying that I'm sure all these strikes in Somalia are killing civilians, but I believe this is the first time that under the Trump administration, AFRICOM has admitted to killing civilians. Before this, they just said they killed either al-Shabaab or ISIS militant. Richard Norland has been appointed to be U.S. ambassador to Libya. Now, I think this may carry a little bit more significance than a typical appointment of an ambassador, because as I talked about, even appointments to important posts like the UAE and Iceland could definitely have some political reasons for them. But this guy is a former advisor on the National Security Council. So I don't know, I almost want to say seems overqualified for the post. And so maybe the U.S. is looking to do something significant in their Libya policy here to come. But the big news in Libya is that, I believe it was Sunday, Field Marshal Haftar, who is formerly a U.S. coup plotter, backed by the CIA, tried to overthrow Gaddafi back in the day. Didn't work out, so he moved to Virginia and stayed there for a few years. Once Gaddafi finally went down, he went back to Libya and raised an army that over the first part of 2019 has consolidated power over East Libya, took an important city in central Libya, which is I believe Daraa, and then has now taken the south of Libya. And he said, there's a last remaining quarter of the country, the northwest corner, and it contains the capital of Tripoli, as well as a couple other important cities. And he told his forces to march on the city. Apparently they carried out an airstrike. I wasn't aware that, Field Marshal Haftar had any control over an air force whatsoever enough to carry out an airstrike. But maybe, this is a missile attack or, some kind of suicide drone, that just flies in and explodes. Or it could be that I know the UAE has carried out airstrikes on behalf of Haftar in the past, although I don't think the UAE would be behind this particular strike, as they told Haftar to kind of step back on this action. The Egyptians are also supportive of Haftar, so it could be Egypt, Russia as well. In some even Western countries like France, Haftar recently received some pretty significant medical treatment in that country, even though he's an accused war criminal. From what I understand, the actual government and military or red tag group of militias called the military of the US and UN-backed government, that is the Tripoli government, really can't defend itself from Haftar, but there is a city, I believe it's Marista, that has a fairly significant militia that in the past has been able to fight off significant militaries of Gaddafi's, and they have launched what they are calling something like Operation Volcanic Eruption, and they say they're going to defend the city. So this probably means a lot of fighting to come from Libya. The U.S. and AFRICOM said that they pulled out all U.S. troops. That's, I guess, a good sign, just, to say that they're not going to try to help defend the city or anything like that, get the U.S. troops the hell out of there. They did say it was a temporary withdrawal, so that I guess that assumes that at some point they will re-enter the country. But that's a significant thing going on in Libya with that war heating up again. There's so much potential for humanitarian catastrophe here, as we've seen with the refugee crisis, people not only trying to get across the Mediterranean, but slave trade and, kidnapping and ransoms going on in Libya, sexual assault and rape off the charts. So fighting's not great. Who knows if Haftar's rule will bring stability, if not, even if he could take this capital. But what we should, really reflect on here is that we should never have set this chain of events off in 2011 by taking out Muammar Gaddafi. All right, that's it for today. Hope everybody's enjoying the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com is my website. Please check that out. Facebook, check out the Libertarian Union, on Twitter at KYAAALE, and patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.